The story of the Soviet Union is a remarkable chapter in human history. It begins in the early 20th century, a time of great upheaval across the globe. In Russia, an ancient empire ruled by czars was crumbling under the immense pressures of war and widespread poverty. Out of this chaos, a new kind of state emerged, one founded on a radical idea called communism. This new nation, officially formed in 1922, was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. It promised to create a society where workers, not kings or wealthy landowners, held power, and where the state owned all property for the benefit of all. It was, a grand and ambitious experiment. For nearly 70 years, the Soviet Union stood as one of the world's two superpowers, locked in a long and tense rivalry with the United States. This period, known as the Cold War, shaped the lives of billions of people across the planet. From the frozen landscapes of Siberia to the bustling cities of Eastern Europe, the influence of the Soviet Union was immense. It sent the first human into space, built a formidable military machine, and supported revolutionary movements far from its own borders. Its existence defined the political, economic, and social landscape of the modern world in ways that are still felt today. This vast country was not governed by a single, unchanging entity, but by a succession of powerful leaders. Each man who rose to the top of the Communist Party brought with him his own vision, his own methods, and his own personality. These leaders guided the nation through monumental triumphs and devastating tragedies. They oversaw periods of rapid industrial growth, terrifying purges, and groundbreaking scientific achievements. Their decisions affected not only the millions of citizens within the Soviet Union's borders, but also the course of international relations for decades. Understanding these individuals is key to understanding the Soviet Union itself. From the revolutionary fervor of its birth to the surprising quietness of its collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union's journey is a tale of power, ideology, and human endeavor. This narrative will explore the lives and legacies of the men who held the reins of this immense state. We will journey through time, from the founder, Vladimir Lenin, to the final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, witnessing how their leadership shaped the destiny of a nation and, in doing so, changed the world forever. It is a story of how a powerful idea was put into practice and the profound consequences that followed. The story of the Soviet Union begins with one man, Vladimir Lenin, born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He was a brilliant and determined revolutionary thinker, deeply affected by the execution of his older brother for plotting against the Tsar. Lenin dedicated his life to overthrowing the old Russian order. He became a fervent follower of the ideas of Karl Marx, adapting them to the specific conditions of Russia. He believed that a disciplined, professional party of revolutionaries was needed to lead the working class to power. This belief became the foundation of the Bolshevik Party, which he led with an unwavering sense of purpose. Lenin's moment arrived in 1917. Russia, exhausted by its involvement in the First World War, was in turmoil. The Tsar had been overthrown, but the provisional government that replaced him was weak and unstable. Seizing this opportunity, Lenin and his Bolsheviks launched a second revolution in October. They stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd and declared the dawn of a new socialist state. Lenin immediately set about fulfilling his promises, pulling Russia out of the war and decreeing that land should be given to the peasants and factories to the workers. His leadership was decisive and uncompromising from the very start. However, establishing this new state was a brutal and difficult task. The Bolsheviks faced fierce opposition from a collection of anti-communist forces known as the White Army, backed by several foreign powers. This sparked a devastating civil war that ravaged the country for years. To win, Lenin implemented a policy known as war communism, which involved seizing grain from peasants to feed the army and the cities. He also established the Cheka, a secret police force, to crush dissent. These were harsh measures, but for Lenin, they were necessary for the survival of the revolution he had fought so hard to achieve. By 1922, the Civil War was won and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially created. Lenin was its undisputed leader, but his health was failing. A series of strokes left him increasingly incapacitated. In these final years, he grew concerned about the direction the new state was taking. particularly the growing power of one of his colleagues, Joseph Stalin. Lenin wrote a testament, a letter to his party, in which he warned against Stalin, describing him as too rude and suggesting he be removed from his post as General Secretary. His warning, however, would go unheeded. Lenin died in January 1924, leaving behind a powerful legacy as the founder of the world's first communist state. Following Lenin's death, a power struggle erupted within the Communist Party. The most prominent figures were Leon Trotsky, a brilliant intellectual and military leader, and Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary. Stalin, whose name meant man of steel, was a master of political strategy. He used his position to build a loyal base of support within the party bureaucracy. While Trotsky argued for a permanent global revolution, Stalin put forward the idea of socialism in one country. He argued that the Soviet Union should focus on building its own strength first. This message proved more popular, and by the late 1920s, Stalin had outmaneuvered all his rivals, including Trotsky, whom he exiled and later had assassinated. Once in complete control, Stalin initiated a period of dramatic and brutal transformation. He launched the first of his 5-year plans in 1928, with the goal of rapidly industrializing the Soviet Union. The country was still largely agricultural, and Stalin was determined to turn it into a modern industrial power capable of defending itself. Huge new factories, dams, and cities were built at a staggering pace. This industrialization came at an immense human cost, with workers facing harsh conditions and unrealistic targets. Yet the achievement was undeniable. In just over a decade, the Soviet Union transformed from a peasant society into a major industrial force. At the same time, Stalin forced a policy of collectivization upon the countryside. He believed that small, privately owned farms were inefficient and a threat to socialist principles. So he ordered that millions of individual peasant farms be merged into large, state-controlled collective farms. This policy was met with widespread resistance, especially from the wealthier peasants, known as kulaks. Stalin responded with merciless force. Millions were executed, arrested, or sent to labor camps in Siberia. The resulting disruption to agriculture, combined with the state's seizure of grain, led to a catastrophic famine, particularly in Ukraine, that killed millions of people. Stalin's rule was defined by absolute power and pervasive terror. In the mid-1930s, he unleashed the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression aimed at eliminating any potential opposition. Old Bolsheviks, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were arrested by the secret police, the NKVD. They were accused of being enemies of the people, forced to confess to imaginary crimes in show trials, and then executed or sent to the vast network of prison camps known as the Gulag. Stalin created a cult of personality around himself, where he was portrayed as an all-wise, fatherly leader. He ruled until his death in 1953, leaving a legacy of both industrial might and unimaginable human suffering. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 sent a wave of uncertainty across the Soviet Union and the world. For nearly 30 years, one man had held absolute power. His demise created a vacuum at the very top of the Soviet system. A collective leadership initially took over, with prominent figures like Georgy Malenkov and the feared head of the secret police, Lavrentiy Beria, vying for control. But it was the seemingly unassuming Nikita Khrushchev who would eventually emerge as the new leader. Khrushchev, a man of peasant origins with a folksy and often blunt personality, had been a loyal Stalinist, but he had a different vision for the future of the country. Khrushchev skillfully navigated the treacherous political landscape of the post-Stalin era. His first major move was to orchestrate the downfall of Lavrentiy Beria, whom many in the leadership feared. With Beria arrested and executed, a major threat was removed. Khrushchev then gradually consolidated his power, outmaneuvering his rivals to become the first secretary of the Communist Party. He presented himself as a reformer, someone who could move the country away from the darkest aspects of Stalin's rule while still upholding the ideals of communism. His rise marked a significant turning point in Soviet history, promising a departure from the terror that had defined the previous decades. The most dramatic moment of Khrushchev's early leadership came in 1956. At a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, he delivered a shocking secret speech. For hours, he denounced Joseph Stalin, revealing the full extent of the dictator's crimes. the personality cult, and the brutal purges that had killed millions of loyal communists. He condemned Stalin's paranoia and his abuse of power, sending shockwaves through the entire communist world. The speech was a bombshell. It was the first time anyone at such a high level had dared to criticize the man who had been portrayed as a genius and a hero for so long. This process of de-Stalinization, as it came to be known, ushered in a period of relative liberalization often called the Khrushchev thaw. Thousands of political prisoners were released from the Gulag camps. There was a greater degree of freedom in culture and the arts, with previously banned books and films becoming available. People began to breathe a little more freely, feeling that the constant fear of arbitrary arrest was receding. While the Communist Party's grip on power remained absolute, Khrushchev had initiated a profound shift. He was attempting to give Soviet communism a more human face, moving away from the iron fist of his predecessor. Nikita Khrushchev's time in power was, well, a period of contradictions, marked by some spectacular successes and honestly some dangerous confrontations. One of his greatest triumphs was in the field of science and technology. The Soviet space program under his leadership achieved a series of stunning firsts that really captured the world's imagination. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, a feat that shocked the United States and ignited the space race. This was followed in 1961 by an even greater achievement, sending Yuri Gagarin into space, making him the first human to orbit our planet. These successes were, powerful symbols of Soviet technological prowess and a source of immense national pride. Domestically, Khrushchev focused on improving the lives of ordinary citizens. He launched a massive housing construction program to address the chronic shortage of living space in Soviet cities. Millions of families moved out of crowded communal apartments and into their own small, prefabricated flats, which became known as Khrushchevkas. While these buildings were often criticized for their poor quality, they did represent a significant improvement in the standard of living for many. He also sought to reform agriculture with his Virgin Lands campaign, which aimed to increase grain production by ploughing up vast tracts of uncultivated land in Kazakhstan and Siberia. However, Khrushchev's leadership was also defined by a series of foreign policy crises. His impulsive and often confrontational style led to several tense moments in the Cold War. In 1961, he authorized the construction of the Berlin Wall, a stark physical symbol of the division between East and West. The most dangerous moment of his rule, and perhaps of the entire Cold War, came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, just off the coast of the United States, brought the world to the very brink of nuclear war. The crisis was eventually resolved through diplomacy, but it exposed the immense dangers of his high-stakes brinkmanship. Ultimately, Khrushchev's reforms and erratic behavior alienated powerful figures within the Communist Party. His agricultural policies proved to be a failure, leading to poor harvests and food shortages. His colleagues in the leadership grew tired of his impulsive decisions, his embarrassing public outbursts, and his attempts to reorganize the party structure. In October 1964, while Khrushchev was on holiday, a coalition led by Leonid Brezhnev staged a political coup. They forced him to retire, accusing him of harebrained schemes and personal failures. Khrushchev lived out the rest of his life in quiet obscurity, a dynamic but flawed leader who had tried and, well, failed to reform the Soviet system. After the unpredictable and often chaotic years of Khrushchev's rule, the rise of Leonid Brezhnev in 1964 was welcomed by the Soviet elite. Brezhnev represented a return to stability and predictability. He was a cautious and conservative figure, really, a product of the party bureaucracy who valued order above all else. His style of leadership was collective, at least initially, and he made it clear that there would be no more of Khrushchev's harebrained schemes. The main goal of the Brezhnev era was to maintain the status quo. This desire for stability, however, would eventually lead to a long period of political, economic, and social stagnation that would have profound consequences for the Soviet Union. Under Brezhnev, the process of de-Stalinization was quietly reversed. While there was no return to the mass terror of the 1930s, the limited freedoms of the Khrushchev thaw were curtailed. Dissent was no longer tolerated. Dissidents, writers, activists, and intellectuals who criticized the Soviet system were harassed, arrested, and sometimes confined to psychiatric hospitals. The state's control over culture and information was tightened once again. In foreign policy, Brezhnev asserted the Soviet Union's dominance over its Eastern European satellite states. This was made brutally clear in 1968 when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, a period of liberal reform. Brezhnev declared that the USSR had the right to intervene in any socialist country where communism was under threat. Economically, the Brezhnev years appeared for a time to be a period of calm prosperity. The standard of living for many ordinary Soviet citizens reached its peak during the 1970s. This was largely funded by high global prices for oil, a key Soviet export. People had access to more consumer goods, and there was a sense of security and predictability in daily life. However, underneath this surface of stability, the Soviet economy was beginning to fail. The centrally planned system was becoming increasingly inefficient and unable to adapt to new technologies. Growth slowed down dramatically, and the country began to fall further and further behind the West in terms of technological innovation and productivity. The final years of Brezhnev's rule, which lasted until his death in 1982, were characterized by a profound sense of drift and decay. Brezhnev himself was in declining health, a frail and often confused figure who became a symbol of the system's own infirmity. A vast and corrupt bureaucracy resisted any attempts at reform, content to manage the decline. The decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979 proved to be a disastrous miscalculation, bogging the Soviet army down in a long and costly war that became their own Vietnam. By the time Brezhnev died, the Soviet Union was a superpower in crisis, grappling with a stagnant economy, a costly war, and an aging leadership that had no answers to the country's mounting problems. Following the death of Leonid Brezhnev in November 1982, the Soviet Union entered a brief but significant period governed by two elderly and ailing leaders. The first to take power was Yuri Andropov. For 15 years, Andropov had been the head of the KGB, the powerful Soviet security service. This background gave him a unique and clear-eyed perspective on the deep-seated problems facing the country. He was more intelligent and energetic than the frail Brezhnev, and seemed to understand that the Soviet Union was in a state of pre-crisis. Andropov believed that without serious changes, the system itself was at risk of collapse. Andropov's brief time as leader, which lasted only 15 months, was marked by a determined effort to tackle the issues that had festered under Brezhnev. His main focus was on discipline and anti-corruption. He launched a campaign to root out the widespread corruption that had become endemic in the party and state bureaucracy. He also tried to improve economic efficiency by cracking down on absenteeism and drunkenness in the workplace. Police would even conduct raids in shops and public baths during working hours, demanding to know why people were not at their jobs. While these measures had some initial effect, they were essentially attempts to make the old system work better, rather than to change the system itself. Unfortunately, Andropov was already seriously ill when he came to power, suffering from severe kidney failure. He spent much of his short rule governing from a hospital bed. His most significant long-term contribution may have been his recognition of a new generation of reformers within the party. He saw potential in a younger, more dynamic official from the Stavropol region named Mikhail Gorbachev, and he promoted him to a key position in Moscow. Andropov was grooming Gorbachev for future leadership, seeing him as someone who could carry forward the cause of reform. Andropov died in February 1984, his ambitious plans for renewal largely unfulfilled. After Andropov's death, the old guard of the Communist Party reasserted itself. They were wary of Andropov's reformist zeal and opted for a much safer choice, Konstantin Chernenko. Chernenko was a long-time protege of Brezhnev and at 72 was already in extremely poor health when he took office. His selection was a clear signal that the party elite wanted to return to the comfortable stagnation of the Brezhnev era. Chernenko's rule was essentially a holding action. He reversed some of Andropov's anti-corruption initiatives, and there was a partial return to the Brezhnev style of leadership. His time in power was so short and uneventful that it is often seen as little more than a brief interlude before the inevitable arrival of a new generation. Chernenko died after just 13 months in office, in March 1985. The death of Konstantin Chernenko in March 1985 marked the end of an era. The rule of the old, infirm leaders was over. The Communist Party's Central Committee moved swiftly to appoint a successor, and their choice was the man Yuri Andropov had championed, Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, Gorbachev was a stark contrast to his recent predecessors. He was young, energetic, and articulate. He represented a new generation of Soviet leaders who had not been directly involved in Stalin's purges and who understood that the country was facing a profound crisis. Gorbachev believed that the Soviet Union could not continue on its current path and that radical reform was not just desirable, but essential for its survival. Gorbachev introduced two key concepts that would define his time in power: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, which means openness, was a policy aimed at increasing transparency in government and ending the state's monopoly on information. For the first time, the media was allowed to report on social and economic problems, to criticize officials, and to discuss historical events that had long been taboo, such as Stalin's crimes. This new openness unleashed a wave of public debate and political energy that the country had not seen since the 1920s. It was a revolutionary change that fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and its citizens. The second pillar of his reforms was perestroika, or restructuring. This was a far-reaching program of economic and political reform. Gorbachev aimed to revitalize the stagnant Soviet economy by introducing elements of market mechanics, allowing for some private enterprise and giving state-run factories more autonomy. Politically, perestroika led to more democratic elections and the creation of a new, more powerful parliament. Gorbachev believed that by reforming the communist system, he could make it more efficient and humane, thereby strengthening it. He did not intend to destroy the Soviet Union. His goal was to save it from itself. In foreign policy, Gorbachev brought about a dramatic end to the Cold War. He introduced what he called new political thinking, which rejected the idea of an inevitable conflict between communism and capitalism. He sought cooperation with the West, particularly with the United States under President Ronald Reagan. Gorbachev initiated unprecedented arms control agreements, withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan, and, most significantly, refused to use force to prop up the communist regimes in Eastern Europe. When popular uprisings swept across the region in 1989, Gorbachev let them run their course, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the peaceful collapse of communist rule throughout the Eastern Bloc. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, intended to save the Soviet Union, ultimately unleashed forces that he could not control. The policy of glasnost allowed long-suppressed nationalist sentiments to emerge. The 15 republics that made up the USSR, from the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to the nations of the Caucasus and Central Asia, began to demand greater autonomy and soon full independence. The economic reforms of perestroika, meanwhile, failed to deliver the promised improvements. Instead, they disrupted the old command economy without creating a functioning market system, leading to widespread shortages, inflation, and economic chaos. People's lives became more difficult, not easier. As Gorbachev's popularity at home plummeted, a new political rival emerged, Boris Yeltsin. A former ally of Gorbachev, Yeltsin became a radical populist who championed Russian nationalism and called for much faster and more drastic reforms. He was elected president of the Russian Republic, the largest and most powerful of the Soviet republics, in June 1991. This created a tense situation with two presidents, Gorbachev of the Soviet Union and Yeltsin of Russia, vying for power from their offices in Moscow. Yeltsin's growing influence directly challenged Gorbachev's authority and the very existence of the Central Soviet government. The final crisis came in August 1991. A group of hardline communist officials, desperate to halt the reforms and prevent the disintegration of the Soviet Union, launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his holiday home in Crimea and announced that they had taken control. However, the coup was poorly organized and met with widespread popular resistance in Moscow, led by Boris Yeltsin. Standing atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, Yeltsin defiantly rallied the people against the plotters. After 3 days, the coup collapsed, but it had dealt a fatal blow to what was left of Gorbachev's authority and the Soviet state. In the aftermath of the failed coup, the process of collapse accelerated rapidly. One by one, the remaining republics declared their independence. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and signed an accord that formally dissolved the Soviet Union. Powerless and presiding over a country that no longer existed, Mikhail Gorbachev had no choice but to accept the inevitable. On the 25th of December 1991, he resigned as president. That evening, the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. After nearly 70 years, the great Soviet experiment had come to a quiet and surprisingly peaceful end.